So I'm very grateful to this panel stepping in kind of last minute to help me have this discussion about similar rules. We thought it was very important to bring it to the membership and to our audience to understand and to see how it is that GMAs are taking very seriously some of the topics that Chairman Perry has brought up and starting to engage in them. So with that, what we thought we would do is provide a review of how two GMAs in particular, GMA 9 and GMA 12, and we've got them staggered here. So the two members of GMA 9, would y'all raise your hands, Dave and Ron? And two members of GMA 12, we got Jim and Gary. And I'll introduce them here in just a second. So what we're going to do is provide you with a review of how it is that these four members in their GMAs have started the process of reviewing their rules and going towards the discussion of similar rules. So before I do that, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself briefly, say who you are, which district you're with, and maybe which GMA as well.
Gary Westbrook, Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. Been the general manager there since 2003, June 10th, 2003. We're in two groundwater management areas, GMA 8 and GMA 12. Of course, most of our work is in GMA 12. That's the central Carrizo area. We do have a little bit of GMA 8, but it's very deep Trinity. We're pleased to be a part of that group, and GMA 8 has done some similar things too. I wanted to mention that. To what we're going to talk about today in GMA 9 and 12, but most of our business is in 12.
Thank you.
My name's Ron. Ooh, this is loud. My name's Ron Fieseler. I'm the general manager of the Blanco-Pedernales Groundwater District in Blanco County. I'm the chairman of GMA 9. I'm also a voting member on Region K, and I'm Region K's liaison with Region L, so sometimes I have trouble keeping my nose above water. I mean, it's so deep. But I've been in groundwater management since 1989. 12 years of that was with the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer District in southern Travis and northern Hays County. And since then, I've been the general manager out in Blanco County.
My name is Jim Totten. I'm the general manager for Lost Pines Groundwater District in Lee and Bastrop counties. I've been the general manager there for about 3 years now. We're part of Region 12, GMA 12, along with Gary. I think I may be the odd man out here that I'm the only one that's in a single GMA.
All right, my name's Dave Mauk. I'm the general manager, Bandera County River Authority Groundwater District. As you heard, we're at GMA 9. We're also in Region J.
Perfect, thank you. So we're going to break the discussion up, first of all, by GMA, and then have a larger discussion about how it is that you've engaged in this process. So we're going to start with GMA 9 with Dave and Ron. And first we thought we would give you a little overview of where GMA 9 is, which districts are a part of it. So here you have a review of GMA 9 up on the screen. You see the districts that are a part of it, and they'll be listed out for you. And is there anything that y'all want to add, just generally, in terms of what's unique about GMA 9?
Well, yes, we've got a couple of areas that have been added. I see the Comal Trinity district is shown there, but we've just recently had a new district formed in southwestern Travis County, which will be incorporating them into GMA 9, but they've always had an honorary non-voting chair at our committee meetings. So we're trying to be inclusive of all the areas within our GMA.
Absolutely, thank you. Your major and minor aquifers listed here. Dave, which are the ones that you're dealing with predominantly in Bandera?
Well, primarily we're going to be dealing with the Trinity group. We do have some of the Edwards Plateau in the western part of the county, but very little of it. Most of our domestic use is going to be out of the middle Trinity, and some of our municipality use is going to be out of the lower Trinity. Those two aquifers in our county do not communicate with each other. Okay. So that's important when you're managing it to realize that.
Thank you. So there's one in particular here, Gillespie County. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Gillespie County is in our priority groundwater management area, as I understand it, but they, during the GMA creation process about 12 years ago or something like that, Gillespie County looked at their geological setting out there and decided that they fit more in with GMA 7, and they petitioned the Water Development Board to be in GMA 7. So they're they're kind of a buffer zone, I guess, between GMA 9 and GMA 7, but they're still in our priority groundwater management area, and we still work very closely with Paul Tiber and the Gillespie district out there.
And I believe he was a part of your general manager meeting, correct? When you do get together sometimes,
Yes.
he joins part of that?
Sure.
Wonderful. And I think that here we wanted to indicate hydrologically how it's interconnected, right, which you referred to. So just kind of an image of that.
Yes.
Ron Fieseler, you're our resident geologist. Is there anything about the geology of GMA 9 that is unique or particular?
It's very complex. I heard you discussing the issue of having projects crossing district lines. Well, we sometimes have projects that cross fault lines, and I can show you places, at least in Blanco County, where you can get a 500-gallon-a-minute well, and then you throw a rock and you'll get a 5-gallon-a-minute well. It's due to the faulting and the local geology. It's very complex, and that's something that all the districts out there have to deal with in one way or another. And so we are very interested in the science of the groundwater out there, the hydrology, the geology, and everything. We'll be probably talking more about that as we move along.
Perfect, thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about the significance of being in a Pigma area, a priority groundwater management area, and what that means?
Well, to me, it means that no matter what the weather's doing, that we're in a constant state of coming in or out of a drought. And we use it in our education and outreach to show people, in Bandera County, I mean, they say we get 36 inches of average rainfall a year. That's just not the case. We either get 50, 60 inches or we get 12. So being in that Pigma helps us to educate the public that you've got to sit there and be in charge of your own destiny also. You've got to conserve your water, protect your well, because we don't have necessarily a very uniform aquifer like San Antonio. It's people watch the news in San Antonio, they see the size of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, puts out what the Edwards is at, and they think they can call and find out what the Middle Trinity's like, and it's not like that there. So being in that Pigma gives us a good outreach component to educate the public, I think.
We also have a 50 to 60 inch evaporative loss each year. When we get an average of 30 inches of rain, we're having double that in evaporative losses. So there's some issues with that. Pigma is an area that's expected to have groundwater shortages or problems or whatever within the next few years and so forth. And we can see that from time to time just during our drought stages. In Blanco County, I've got the total water availability from our MAG is about 8,000 acre feet. There's districts out here that pump that out of one well a year. So we have completely different hydrogeological needs and concerns that we have to address in our districts, our GMA, and our Pigma.
Perfect, thank you. So before we go into looking at some of the comparison that you started, I wanted to ask you broadly to speak to why did you decide to get together as GMs of GMA 9? When did that happen? What did that process look like? And what have you noticed so far?
Well, I'll start out by saying that the districts in GMA 9 were actually meeting on a cooperative basis even before the groundwater management areas were created. We met 2 or 3 times a year to discuss rule issues, problems we were having, permit concerns, geological questions, whatever it was that was on the topic of discussion. And then when the GMA process came along, we just sort of fell right into it. It was just a natural extension of what we were already doing. But regarding the similar rules issue, we had a GMA 9 meeting back in March of this year, right in the middle of session. There was a lot of things going on then, and we felt like we needed to address some of those. And at that time, we decided that we did need to pay attention to the issues being raised about similar rules, about problems being created by different district rules across district boundaries. And so we determined that we would call a managers meeting to get a bunch of managers together to look at our rules, compare rules, or at least start the process, brainstorm, come up with whatever we could as a scheme to address these issues and concerns. And that meeting happened in July 24th of this year. We had about 12 groundwater district managers present. That included 12 different groundwater districts and either 3 or 4 GMAs. I'd have to go back and count, but this was cross GMA boundaries, cross district boundaries. So that indicated to me that we had a lot of interest in trying to address these issues. We met for 2 or 3 hours. We formed a subcommittee that's going to take the rules of the districts that were there and compare those and start the process. We're going to have some more meetings this fall.
Okay, thank you. And there was a particular piece of legislation that was filed, right, that was looking specifically at the Hill Country and maybe unification of some of the districts?
Well, we certainly had our attention level raised when there was a bill filed to basically delete, click the X on 5 groundwater districts out in our area and create some new district magically out of those 5. And I never saw so many people get so mad so quickly because of that whole process. And that's the reason we called that meeting in March. And some of us met with the legislator in question. We had one legislator present at that March meeting who was encouraging us to be proactive, which we did, as you can hear from what we've been planning to do. And the bill finally died in committee, but it was a real wake-up call that this sort of thing can keep happening session after session, perhaps, until something does happen. So we wanted to be proactive and move in a direction that would hopefully steer us into a process where we could justify our rules with each other, and we'll move forward with that.
Thank you. Absolutely, please.
Yeah, with my district, we got a set of core values that we actually guide our day-to-day operations by. And 3 of those are dedication to science, leadership and collaboration, and transparency. And these literally are our marching orders. My colleagues, myself, my board take it very seriously. And because of that, in order to achieve that, you have to cooperate and collaborate with your neighbors. You got to work together with other districts. You got to work together with stakeholders. And we do. And most of the people that I know of up in the Hill Country do work together. We share data. We share personnel at times. We go out and help each other log wells, do geophysical logging. We get out and do water quality testing together. We'll go down to San Antonio and work with San Antonio. They'll bring people up to us. And I think it just makes sense to look at the object, look at the ability to do common rules and see where rules should complement each other and see where rules shouldn't necessarily be the same. And I think we've been doing it for years.
So tell me a little bit about this, because we're about to go through a series of slides that show a comparison of some of the demographics within the district, so starting to just lay the foundation. I understand that you've gone a little further or plan to go further. Will you tell me a little bit about what your plan or process was in looking at the similar rules? How did you determine to start doing this?
Well, we at our meeting we looked at as a brainstorming session. We came up with some ideas on how to approach this. We wanted to see the similarities, obviously. We also wanted to figure out what differences we had and the reasoning behind those differences. Perhaps it was based on geology or hydrology or whatever. We wanted to see the basis for all these rulemaking decisions, perhaps local needs and that sort of thing. We had some enabling legislation issues. We wanted to base it on science. That's why we're so heavily into science in our area. We've cooperated on developing management plans and rules. I've personally been involved in helping 4 or 5 other districts in our local area develop their management plans and rules, and now it's coming full circle because we're revising our rules, and I'm pulling some ideas from the Burnett County District, the Comal County District, the Hayes County District, the Barton Springs District, Gillespie, and so it's all being intermeshed on those sort of fronts. Dave mentioned our geophysical logging. We share a geophysical logging and downhole camera unit with Blanco County, Bandera County, Gillespie County, and Burnett County. That's 4 groundwater districts, but 3 GMAs.
And Ron,
we're looking at maybe incorporating Comal County.
Would you tell the audience what a geophysical logging trailer does?
Okay, we lower tools into a well, and then we pull them out of the well, and either on the way in or out, we log the natural geological and hydrological characteristics of the well. And that enables us to identify the various geological units that the well is drilled through or completed in. And we can develop that information into geological cross-sections. And we've worked cooperatively on that with the different groundwater districts involved. We've created a geological atlas for part of Hayes and Travis and Blanco County. It's a huge book, 2 foot by 3 foot, giant coffee table book. And so we are cooperating. We develop our data, and a lot of that data that we're creating through logging and from our aquifer tests and water quality sampling goes directly to the Water Development Board every year. So we are sharing our data with the state, and I don't know that every district has a water quality sampling program, but those that do, as far as I know, are willing and happy to share that with the Water Development Board. It's just a great cooperative effort between the local districts and the state.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we walk through some of these slides and kind of look at where your districts and the demographics in your districts are similar, and maybe point out some of those areas where they're different as well. And then after that, we'll have a further conversation about what some of the implications are. So we've alluded to the districts that are in the GMA 9 Hill Country Pigma. We have them listed here for you. There are some special considerations that were alluded to earlier. One is that the Edwards Aquifer Authority is in there. It's a non-voting member of GMA 9, but an honorary committee seat for joint planning purposes because of their significance. And then another special consideration is that Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District has additional powers of a river authority as well, and so that's kind of a unique characteristic. There was a bill that was also brought up this session that talked about having additional seats at the GMA table, and your GMA is one of them that has honorary seats, as you said, right?
And Travis County will be added to this list.
That's right. So first of all, you have just a general comparison of when it is that these various districts were created, what their various enabling legislation is. And then you have a breakdown, especially interesting perhaps, is where some of them are tax-based or fee-based or both. If y'all have any comments on any of this, please do chime in, but I thought I would just run through some of this first demographics. Oh, and perhaps going back as well, annual income is another interesting difference between the districts to note. Do you have anything to say about some of the differences in financial capacity between the districts in GMA 9?
There's been 1 or 2 districts in GMA 9 that initially struggled due to their fee or lack of tax structure in some cases. It's been difficult for districts that are underfunded. I think that a district really needs to have adequate funding in order to carry out the purposes of a district, and we've seen that happen a couple times where districts struggle initially, but then sometimes they can fix it, and other times they keep struggling, but it's an issue, I think.
One issue that I remember coming up through the last joint planning process was in the payment of some of that science and data and studies that had to occur, how it is that you evenly split up the cost of that between districts that have differing budgets was a discussion that came up, I believe.
Yeah, when we had to prepare an explanatory report, like a lot of other GMAs, we were essentially forced to hire a consulting firm. A couple of districts had the skills and capability to do it themselves, but we didn't have the time. So we hired a consulting firm to work on an explanatory report, and in GMA 9's case, it cost us $65,000 that we had not planned on until that popped into our plate. And we divided that up between the 9 groundwater districts that were involved at the time, and 1 or 2 districts had to work out the just a little bit a month type thing, just a payment plan basically in order for them to pay their fair share. So it was a real struggle in some cases.
Thank you. Here we list out how many of the GCDs within GMA9 are part of various regional planning groups as well, so you see some of the interconnected kind of nature and that web there. And then finally looking at what the primary water uses and demographics are. And I'd like to remind the audience that in the case of GMA9, the information that you see here is really just kind of looking predominantly at the demographics and water uses before looking at the rule comparisons. And then GMA12 is different in the way that they address the process, in that you kind of looked more at the rules first. And so in terms of the usage, the primary water usage you'll see is fairly homogeneous through GMA9. Would you say that that's accurate? Fairly similar? Yeah? Okay. Some county census data, just so you can have a sense of the general population size differences. And of course, in GMA9, you're butting up against one of our fastest growing populations in Texas as well. And so I know that you are frequently on the cusp of that urban-rural population dynamic, and that factors a lot into some of the GMA discussions. A little comparison on what the district taxable value is as well, and you can see some of the differences there. And we're just kind of rolling through this to give you a taste of it. And the average annual production and some of the differences. Dave, do you have anything to comment on in terms of what some of the differences are in annual production across the districts, or what you might see in Bandera?
Well, one thing I want to point out, you say that, the use is pretty much, somewhat uniform, but like our neighbor, Kerr County, they have Kerrville, which is a big city. A lot of their usage are public water supply systems, where in our area, a lot of it's exempt wells. And it's a complete different management structure when you're looking at exempt well versus a permitted well.
Sure.
The permitted well, you've got one big straw or a few big straws that you can actually put under drought management. Where with exempt wells, you have a lot of small straws that can't be put under drought management. So there definitely is a difference in how you have to manage, and that's strictly just going right up the road 20 miles, and it's a complete different reality there.
Also, Kerrville has a aquifer storage and recovery program that they incorporate into their city water management strategies.
Sure, absolutely, one of 3 in Texas. Well, thank you. We're going to move on to GMA12 and look a little bit at the process that y'all had. And before we ask you about the process, we wanted to similarly kind of lay out who the districts are. So there are 5 groundwater districts in GMA12. We've got 2 of them represented here, Lost Pines and Post Oak Savannah. For context, here is Texas, if you didn't know what shape it was. Those colored areas are the groundwater districts. And that little area there is GMA12. And if you look at a picture of the major aquifers in Texas, you'll notice that it is fairly similar to the shape of the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer, correct? So you see that there again, GMA12 forming that shape along the aquifer. Was there something in particular about zooming in? This was just a zoom in, correct? So that y'all see exactly
yeah, it's just for context.
Just for context, perfect, thank you. And those are our five GMA districts. So before we go into a conversation about how it is that you compared your wells, I wanted to ask you, why did your GMs decide to get together? When did that happen? What was the process like? And what have you noticed so far?
Well, I think one of the things that's very interesting, in our enabling legislation, we actually, Senator Ogden had put in back in 2001 that all of our districts could, if they so chose, come together and create an additional layer of bureaucracy that would have been called the Central Carrizo Coordinating Council, I believe was the terminology. The districts chose not to do that, but we did begin to meet on a fairly regular basis and talk about issues that were similar to some of the issues that GMA9 has already discussed. And so that was already going on once to twice a year between the general managers of our 5 groundwater districts before the 2005 changes came along and really got started. Since then, the GMA process kicked in.
And the 2005 process would be starting the GMAs.
Yeah, well, we already had GMAs delineated, but the DFC process really became real then. And we began to see, how we were going to need to manage together. And so we already had some foundation put in place. Of course, that all evolved at that point and began to evolve, and that evolution is still continuing. More modernly, I would say that over the last couple of years, we've begun to talk amongst ourselves about differences and similarities and and why certain things are done in different ways amongst our districts. And what we found as we got together and met more often, by the way, we've met officially 4 times. We post those meetings because 4 of our 5 general managers actually represent their groundwater conservation districts on GMA 12 as voting representatives. The most recent meeting we had was just a couple of weeks ago at our summit, our groundwater summit in Burleson County. And so we've talked about our similarities and differences so that we could learn from each other. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Jim's thought of some things that we haven't, and we've thought of some things that Alan's district hasn't, and so forth. And so Alan took it upon himself about 6 months ago to go through our rules and management plan and put together a list of about 18 to 20 items, and you're going to see a few examples of these, where we have similarities and differences so that we'd have some structure for our discussion and so that the public would find it a little easier to follow along.
Thank you.
And that's been a very important process for us.
Thanks, Gary. Jim, what's your experience been of the process? How would you describe the process of looking at your rules and finding the similarities and differences?
It's been an interesting process. I didn't realize kind of how much we actually had in common between our districts, even though each district was set up a little bit differently under its enabling legislation, and each district has definitely different demographic pressures that we look at. There are a lot of commonalities I didn't realize were there. Some of these slides will highlight there are a few key differences as well. And unfortunately, the other Joe Cooper would be able to better explain where some of those differences came from, but I'll try and explain them as we get there. But it has been an eye-opening experience to see where we do have those common ground. And as Gary pointed out, there are things that we haven't thought of in Lost Pines that Post Oak said, oh, we've had that rule on the books since 2005. And so definitely we can borrow from each other and start kind of shoring up and building a more common network of rules between us.
Great, thank you. So why don't we walk through some of these slides, and maybe you can talk specifically about where it is that you found differences, because this is really looking more at the rules, and maybe talk a little bit about why you think those rules might be different. So on this first slide, we have the differences in what determines what is an exempt well.
They should have used bigger font.
Apologies.
Oh, there we go.
And so the two that stand out here above the 25,000, 50,000 is Brazos Valley and Mideast. Now I know neither of you are representatives for that, but do you know from your discussions why it is that those two are different?
Well, I think each one of us looked at the local situation that we have. When you've got larger users, maybe you've got the city of Bryan College Station, you've got different concerns. Obviously, we don't have that. So when we looked at our local situations, what most of our individual landowners needed, and tried to be as conservation-minded as possible, I think that's what led to some of the discussions and decisions, as far and also the availability in certain aquifers. I know for our instance, and some of the other districts in GMA 12, we looked at not only the individual aquifers, and we all have about 6 or 7 aquifers that are being used and utilized. And so we looked at the folks, the demographics that are using those wells, and then we set those limits either in line with what's already in legislative statute or some different amount, as you see there.
All right, thank you. They looked at whether they require permits for frac wells, and only one does not require permits. And Jim, why is that?
I honestly don't have the historical answer for why we never required a permit for frac wells. I know that during the last round of really high frac activity, which was back in right around the time I started, so about 5 years ago, the issue definitely came up about requiring those permits, but at the same time that the issue about permitting fracking came up, we were also handling several large permit requests that the board was having to work its way through for a couple of different water marketing organizations. So it kind of got put on the back burner. It's something we need to revisit, but at the time it just wasn't something that we had really the time or the energy to focus on.
You may or may not have been busy with some important litigation.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the topics that was discussed a lot through the session was of varying permitting approaches. And so in your rules comparison, that's one of the topics that really comes up. And so permitting by production acreage, all of your fellow GMA 12 members do permit that way. And again, there's a difference with Lost Pines. And so not to put you on the hot seat, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
And again, this is based on my understanding, so there's kind of been a game of telephone between the original general manager, the previous general manager, Joe Cooper, the other Joe Cooper, and then myself. My understanding is at the time that the district was established and they were looking at rules, they looked at the concept of using kind of the same permitting by acreage that the other districts were implementing, and the hydrogeologist that they had on staff at the time made the recommendation that a sustainable permitting structure based on permitting by acreage would be on the order of acre inches per acre of surface acreage. He basically recommended a very, very small amount of permitted production based on acreage. And again, my understanding at the time, the board looked at that and looked at the number of small rural water providers that we had and felt that that would put an undue burden on the rural water providers as well as the municipalities to have to go out and lease up incredibly large tracts of land just to get that acre inches per acre. And so they chose to go a different direction, which is permitting based on beneficial use.
Great, thank you.
You know, one of the things that you're looking at there and you're thinking correlative rights, which is important, but each of us has similar spacing requirements in these aquifers. And really when you get down to it, the spacing is what helps create some of that correlative right. And so from that standpoint, even though we don't have acreage assigned, I think there's a great similarity in our spacing rules amongst us that does account for some of that correlative right.
And Gary, when you talk about spacing, you're talking about well spacing, correct?
Yeah, well spacing, either from your neighbor's property line or from another well in the same aquifer.
So we didn't include slides. Y'all did go about doing a comparison of what the well spacing is between different aquifers. Is that correct?
We did.
And we chose,
Alan did.
Alan did.
Let's give Alan a little credit. He's sitting out there.
And we decided not to include those just because there were so many of them to go through. But it is interesting to note that the well spacing you see as being a critical component of protection of private property rights. And
Right.
good deal. So this is obviously just points out the beneficial use permitting structure. And then the production acreage that's assigned to that permitting. Obviously, that's not applicable to Lost Pines. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about how it is that you determined the production acreage assignment in Post Oak?
You know, when Post Oak was first going through this process was back in 03 and 04, and we were looking at what our local needs were as far as landowners. And like every district, you know, you've got local issues that you're trying to deal with and satisfy. We have a lot of agriculture in our groundwater conservation district. And in our particular area, Texas A&M had done some work and ag extension, and everyone had come up with a basis of about 2 acre-feet per acre per year is what you would need to irrigate just about any crop that we were normally growing in those areas. And so we thought that was a conservative place to be or a place to start. We're still at 2 acre-feet per acre per year. But it takes care of the agriculture interest in our district, and that's why we started there.
Thank you. Okay, so it was not an arbitrary determination. It was based on...
No, not at all. It was based on some factual evidence and science, you know, some studies.
Great, thank you. So this slide was actually included. As you know, districts are statutorily required to manage to the DFC, not to the MAG, but you chose to include this slide in the last presentation that you gave in order to ensure that the public really understood that you have a MAG allocation, but that you are really managing to the DFC. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I really think it was just there. I mean, I didn't prepare the slide deck. I think Gary put it together. And I don't want to put words in Gary's mouth, but I think it really was just kind of put there to clarify that the management of the aquifers is being done across the GMA to the DFCs. The MAGs offer useful guidelines, but the actual management of the formations is being done based on the DFCs.
And interesting, in this particular round of planning, joint planning, we actually have adopted not only individual DFCs as we did in the last round, but we've also, as a group, adopted aquifer-wide DFCs. And that, you know, again, the trend toward moving toward joint planning and joint management. So that was an important point for folks to kind of wrap their mind around.
Thank you. Permit term length was another hot button discussion during the interim and into session. And Jim, I think in particular for you, a discussion about how long it takes to get a permit is something that we saw come up several times. So there's a comparison, y'all decided to do a comparison of what your permit term lengths are. Of course, we have legislation as well that allows for automatic renewal. There's a lot of discussion about combining export or transfer permits with operating permits. Will y'all tell us a little bit about some of the differences? I mean, there's obviously one clear difference here. Post Oak Savannah's got 40-year permit terms with 1 year, or for the non-renewable permits. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the 40-year permit, that came out of Chapter 36. You looked at transports, they were 30-year. But we have every 5 years, we have a review process that takes place. And that is very similar to having a 5-year permit. So really, there's a lot of similarity here, even though there might look like there's some difference. The 1 year is something we did for oil and gas. We did some things to expedite frac applications. Man, it doesn't matter how much you work with oil and gas folks. Things change from morning to noon to night. They may walk in today and tell you that they're thinking about doing some work in a month, and they're back the next day, and the bosses have sent them in there to get a permit. So we created a situation where we thought it would be manageable because of the resources that we do have, to where we would issue 1-year permits that were good for a single use for fracking. And that way, we wouldn't have to put them through a hearing process, delay that situation. We also wouldn't be committed to an amount of water that we couldn't back up with science. And so it gave us a management tool that helped both us and them.
Perfect. Thank you. So we already discussed a little bit about the renewals. Obviously, the review every 5 years is the second half of the permit term length there. All 5 of you require export permits. In the discussion that we had during this past session about combining export or transfer permits with operating permits, did that cause any concern for any of you?
I really didn't see an issue with it. At the end of the day, it's the production that has an impact on the aquifer. Where the water goes once it's produced is really a secondary issue. So wrapping transport and export into one package and running them together, I think that makes sense. It makes it easier for the district. It makes it easier for the applicants to keep track of. So I think it caused some heartburn with some of our citizens, but I think for me and for my board, I don't think that was really an issue for us. I think that made sense to do it and run it that way.
If you can't produce it, you can't ship it. So
very true.
And in your particular case, I believe the particular permit that was so much talked about for so many years has a tiered approach, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, for the actual production rates for the actually for both 4-star and NDOP. I'm sorry, now it's Archway Waters and NDOP. Both permits operate on a tiered structure where there's a minimum production requirement for multiple consecutive years that allows for monitoring to establish impacts. And if the production is not showing to have an impact that will exceed the DFC, additional water is added to the permit, and the same procedure repeats as the permit works its way up through those tiers.
Thank you. And then you did a comparison of your fee structures as well. There's one difference there in Fayette County. I know we don't have David up here, but do y'all happen to know why it is that it was different? And if not, that's all right.
Just enabling legislation. That's
legislation.
What was desired there by their citizens.
And I think a lot of times, both in GMA 9 and GMA 12, where we do see differences, a lot of times it's because of particular restrictions or specificities that were defined by the enabling legislation.
You also look at the resources available. If you're not projected to have enough water production to fund your district, then you're going to turn to taxes. And that's part of Fayette's situation that's a little different than ours. By the time you get to that end of our GMA, their resources, even though they may be common with us, the characteristics and capabilities of those aquifers change quite a bit as you get near the Colorado River. So that had a bearing on that.
Thank you. So a topic that is not always popular in Texas is requiring meters for your wells, and we wanted to bring up the fact that all 5 districts in GMA 12 do require meters for permitted wells. And so finally, did you want to add anything before?
Yeah, I'd just say that the full set of those slides is on our website. If you go to posgcd.org, we've got all the stuff from our summit, including this panel, the entire discussion, the videos there. It's kind of an interesting discussion where we get into some more depth there. I think that we've talked about a lot of similarities. These guys started off with demographics, and now they're leading into rules. We started off with an evaluation of rules and management, and that led us into discussions about our demographics.
And so that's exactly my next question for you in these last few minutes, and then I'd like to save a few minutes for questions from the audience if you'll have any. So submit them on Twitter or line up at the mic so I can see you. But now that you've started the process, and I do expect this to be a process, right? It's just kind of the beginning of it. Where do you go from here? What are the lessons learned so far?
GMA 9 is looking at a few challenges here, one of which I mentioned earlier that we're looking not only at similarities in our rules, but differences. And we've noticed that we're having to deal with the enabling legislation issues that are common to many districts. Every district seems to have some peculiarity that they have to address. For instance, in GMA 9, I'll give you an example. All the groundwater districts in GMA 9 require permits for large irrigation wells. There may be a difference in where the permit starts, what level of production or whatever, but we can permit the irrigation wells for a hay meadow or a peach orchard or whatever, with the exception of the Hayes Trinity Groundwater District. Their enabling legislation exempted all agricultural use. And so this inevitably leads to them having different rules, which we cannot resolve. They have to have a different rule for that. And that may involve different fee structures in accordance with their funding mechanisms. So we're going to have to address the differences in the enabling legislation issues for the individual districts and in whatever form this similar rules effort takes. So we have to look at that.
And of course, enabling legislation is often a reflection also of what is politically palatable to the county or to the area that is creating that district, correct?
That's correct. It seems like almost every district has some differences. My district in Blanco County is a little bit unique in that we were created through the petition process. So we did not go through the legislature. We went through the TCEQ petition process. And so we have all Chapter 36 authority and powers, with the exception during our confirmation election, we did eliminate the right of eminent domain. That was a pretty easy throwaway. I don't know of any groundwater district that's ever used eminent domain, so we were okay with getting rid of that one. It wasn't a big deal. So it's an issue that I think all GMAs are going to have to address, because the enabling legislation is going to be the trump card on some of the rules. Another issue that we're paying attention to is this concern that was raised earlier during your discussion with Chairman Perry about the rules being different from one district to the next. We recognize that as a truly valid concern, and it may be site-specific, though, because I've been working in groundwater management since 1989, and in 28 years, I've dealt with several projects that cross district boundaries, and in no single case did we ever have a problem dealing with it. And so I see it as a potential perceived problem that we need to pay attention to, but I personally don't have any basis for seeing an obvious issue out there that's caused real problems.
It's possible, perhaps, that as our population dynamics are changing in Texas, and as Chairman Perry also pointed out, Texas is quite different now than it was 20 years ago, that maybe we're also seeing new challenges crop up, right, in new groundwater markets. We had a panel discussion yesterday on the economy of groundwater valuation. So perhaps some of those are what are bringing up some of the new challenges.
I do recognize it being a problem, though. Like I mentioned earlier, we can have an aquifer that puts out 500 gallons a minute in one well and 5 in another one, literally just a stone's throw away across the fence or whatever. So we are aware that there are problems out there that need to be unified somehow.
The thing that jumps out at me about that, Ron, is that the boundaries are not just across district boundaries, but even within the district itself, right? You might have hydrological boundaries that you're dealing with. Dave, you, I believe, have started, so you went through this demographics comparison, but I think that you had previously, even before the session, started with Headwaters District, perhaps, looking at some rural comparison and maybe some efforts to make those more similar. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes, Headwaters is our neighbor, Kerr County, Kerrville, and I got with Gene Williams, their general manager, and we shared an attorney, and we got together and actually got some permit hearing rules. Now, Gene went ahead and adopted those rules. We decided to wait till after session to see if there's other things we need to address. But some of the districts in our area in GMA 9 do share the same attorneys, and Ron and I share an attorney, and we're looking at adopting some of the same rules with lease permitting.
And I think that there were some obvious candidates for rule similarity, even during that initial meeting we had back last month. Clearly, I think we can go with the definitions. We can probably all come to some agreement on definitions. That's pretty straightforward. And also the procedural rules for public hearings, contested case hearings, things like that. That's pretty well established in Chapter 36 in state law. So I'm convinced that we can make some progress towards similar rules. We're just going to have to look at the finer details when we get down to the individual permits and fees and things like that.
Sure, thank you.
I think Chairman Perry put it very well a while ago. Look into your groundwater district for the best science. That's to us, that's a big deal. We're trying to look ahead. We've already done as GMA 8 did. GMA 8 stepped in. The districts up there, they put forth money to get their model improved. That was a long process, an exceptional process. We've done the same thing in GMA 12. We're working. We're about 2/3 of the way through completion of an update to the central Carrizo model. And so, having that best available data and science is now carrying over into our monitoring. Brazos Valley has stepped up and adopted some protocols on their monitoring. And even though we've got probably as qualified an individual or two individuals as we could hope to have doing our monitoring, we're going to do something similar there and probably adopt the same protocols. And so working together and getting that best science, that best data to help us all make better decisions. But what I wanted to speak to is like Ron said, there's so many things that are in statute that are mandated that make us the same, and that's fine. But when you're looking at your individual districts and their individual situations and what we understand about our individual local resources, what you brought up there, we've got similar aquifers. We got faulting in certain areas and not in others, and those don't consistently move from one end to the other of the aquifer. So understanding all those things, that's incumbent upon us to understand and do a better job of management with that information.
So we have just 2 minutes left, so I want to make sure and ask the two Twitter questions that have come through, which I think are interesting. They're going to be challenging. The first is, maybe more to the GMA 9 folks, Trinity Aquifer doesn't match the Hill Country Pigma, which doesn't match GMA 9, which doesn't match district boundaries. Is that okay?
Sure it is.
Tell us why.
I don't know of any aquifer or any GMA or any groundwater district or any regional planning group that matches exactly any specific geological feature or hydrological feature. I think it's all an approximation. Clearly, when the GMAs were delineated and the regional planning groups were delineated, it was the best effort that could be done at the time. And since then, we've tweaked it a little bit. We've had the EAA drop out of GMA 9, for instance, and we still enjoy having them on our committee as an honorary seat. But we're making small modifications. But if you tried to draw a GMA to coincide with an aquifer, you're going to have the doggonedest gerrymandering you've ever seen. Show that geology map again if you don't believe me. Anyway, I think it's working right now, and yes, we can tweak it a little bit and make it a little bit better as time goes by, but we're all accustomed to dealing with it now, and we understand our local aquifers. My Trinity aquifer is completely different than Dave's, and we're in 50 miles we can have a completely different aquifer, and yet we have the completely different aquifers on either side of a fault. So I think we're okay right now.
I understand that even the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which is, obviously the model that people speak to in terms of an aquifer-wide management structure, doesn't actually cover the full Edwards as well, correct? That's right. Did you want to add anything to that? Great. Then let me give you with the last question, and then we'll just have some closing thoughts. Please explain the difference between correlative rights and a correlative cap on permit amounts. Do you want to take a stab at that, Gary?
Correlative rights and a correlative cap?
Yes, sir.
I guess you're referring to the amount of water available on the per acre per year basis. Those are, you go back to the conservation amendment. We're required to find that balance. You move that forward almost 100 years, and the language that's in Chapter 36, Section 108, our GMAs are required to find the highest practicable amount of water to be produced while balancing that with conservation and preservation. So each of us has tried to look at what the needs are locally, what's going on in our local areas, and come up with that amount that fits. And so, correlative means some correlation. Some maximum production amount should be based on what your science has to say about your local resources, combined with some of the concerns of your local individuals and what they need. At the end of the day, one of the things that we talk about a lot in our board meetings and in our GMAs is that we're groundwater conservation district. We're supposed to conserve, but we're regulating somebody's private property right. If it's under their feet, it belongs to them, and you're going to tell them how much they can have and when they can have it. And that's, that's thin ice. I don't care which way you go. That's a tough balancing act to do, and better science and better data is the only way we're going to get to the definitive answer of where is that balance. And so we're working through it, and it's going to be a process.
Yeah, on the other end of the spectrum, we have a reasonable use approach. The correlative rights way is an easy, no-brainer way of portioning out groundwater. I mean, everybody understands half an acre foot, 1 acre foot, 2 acre foot, or something like that. But in some cases, it simply will not work. And for example, in Blanco County, don't hold me to the numbers exactly, but if we take the total available groundwater and divide it by the number of acres, you'd get something like 400 gallons of water per month per acre. So correlative rights will not work in situations like that. And then we would have to break it further down into the different portions of the aquifer, because I couldn't even give 400 gallons per month in some areas where people are making 1 to 5 gallons a minute. So there's lots of issues here.
Thank you. So we're over time, so I want to ask each of you in one word, just one, to identify what opportunity you think there is for districts to continue to work together on this process. Dave, what's your one thing, one word, or maybe two?
Collaboration and outreach.
Outreach. Thank you.
No, she said I could have two. She said two.
Jim?
Would have been nice to have that question in advance. I honestly don't have a one-word answer for that one. I think collaboration is a good starting point, though.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'll steal his.
Thank you.
Almost the same, communication, and that's between groundwater districts and the legislative process, the legislators themselves, the public, the groundwater districts, and the whole community.
Thank you.
So now that I know we get to say the one word and then explain it, sharing. Our protocols, our management, our information, our data, we share monitor wells with our neighbors. We share the data. We share the workload. We've shared responsibility and improvement of the model. So, yeah, collaboration, sharing.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, folks, we are going to take a break now. Before we thank our panel, I want to remind you to be back here at 10:30 promptly for the Texas Supreme Court Chief Justice Hecht, who's going to give us an incredible keynote. And let's thank these incredible panelists for this good discussion.